I'm delighted to share with you some new research that we've been working on in this area and to give you a feel for a bit of background on research that we have done. So first, by way of background, in my book in 2011 called Niche News, we examined, well, I examined this phenomena called partisan selective exposure. And this is the propensity for people to seek out media that matches their political beliefs. And using data gathered from 2004 and some from 2008, I found persistent evidence that this behavior exists to a huge degree. And it doesn't matter what medium I looked at, whether I looked at the newspapers people read, whether they endorsed Democratic or Republican presidential candidates, whether I looked at talk radio, whether I looked at web use, or whether I looked at cable news use. Consistently, people's political identity predicted the news media that they elected to use. I found this not only cross-sectionally, I found it using panel data, and I also did some field work where we were looking at what magazines people picked up in a waiting room, and even in a waiting room, their browsing behavior, I can predict it based on their partisanship. So I think we have consistent evidence that there is something about like-minded media that draws people toward those media outlets. Now, one of the outcomes that I examined in Niche News was looking at polarization. And the way that I looked at polarization is a term that we've already discussed here, which is affective polarization. So I was looking at feeling thermometers and the difference between them for the different candidates. And I wanted to know, for those individuals that were looking at like-minded media, did they have more politically polarized attitudes? And it turns out that they do. So individuals who are looking at like-minded partisan media are more favorable toward their party's candidate and less favorable toward the candidate of the opposition. And this holds true, again, across a variety of media types. So it's true for newspapers, talk radio, websites, cable news. It's also true in panel data, and it's also true at the aggregate level in time series analysis. So I think we have pretty consistent evidence here that there is something about partisan media that's having an effect on people's polarized political attitudes. Now, when I've given talks about this in the past, one thing that people have often brought up is, yes, that's true, but mainstream news is also quite popular. And if you look just at Nielsen ratings, and we're only looking at news on television, which is, of course, only a small subset of partisan news media options that are available, but if we only focus on television news, well, look at the ratings for NBC, CBS, and ABC, and isn't this an issue that we should be concerned with? And so I hear this in two forms. In one form, it's, well, maybe partisan news isn't such a big deal because people are also going to the mainstream news media. So maybe the mainstream news exposure cancels out partisan news media. And the second form is maybe this is a fix. Maybe we should encourage people who are partisans and diehard partisans to go to the mainstream news media, and maybe that'll curb some of the polarization tendencies. And so what I wanted to do in the work for this conference is to look at whether mainstream news viewing stunts the effects of like-minded news exposure. And so to do that, I decided to look at a contemporary case study looking at the Keystone XL pipeline and some of the news coverage that's been out about it. And it's particularly fortuitous because in January of 2014, this report was in fact released. And both mainstream news media and partisan news media covered this report. So it presented just a wonderful opportunity to find out what happens when people hear exposure to like-minded and mainstream news coverage. How do their attitudes change, and how do these outlets actually cover an identical report? So I did an experiment, and in this experiment there are 5 different conditions. First, some were exposed to a control condition in which they did not see any of the media coverage whatsoever. In a second condition, I feel quite strongly that I am able to justify doing a like-minded news condition given how much evidence I believe there is that people look for like-minded news media. And in the like-minded news condition, Republicans were assigned to watch Fox News coverage of this report, Democrats were assigned to watch MSNBC, and I randomized the true independents. As we heard earlier today, there actually aren't that many of them, so it was a very small percentage of the total sample that I looked at. For the third condition, I had people watch mainstream news coverage from NBC News, and then the next two I think are really interesting because this is how we can try to tease out, can mainstream news have some sort of a moderating effect? So I did it in 2 ways to test whether or not order matters. There's been some previous research looking at inoculation, which is a phenomenon in the communication literature, that order sometimes matters and sometimes doesn't. So I was curious whether it would. So in one condition, they watched the like-minded news coverage, and then afterward, they watched the mainstream news coverage. And then in the final condition, they watched the mainstream news coverage and then the like-minded news coverage afterward. Hypotheses that I was looking at, first, my hypothesis was that partisans viewing the mainstream clip will exhibit fewer differences in the facts shown than partisans viewing like-minded clips. So this is essentially the argument that partisans are going to be able to detect the facts in the mainstream news coverage, but when they get their like-minded news coverage, there are going to be huge discrepancies on the facts of what was included in this report. Next, media trust. Again, a shout out to John Ladd, who's in our audience, who's done some great work on media trust. We're going to be looking at whether that was affected by clip order, whether mainstream or partisan news was seen first. Next, I suspected that people's beliefs about the pipeline will be most polarized in the like-minded condition, that perhaps the mainstream news media would tame this just a little bit, and finally the mainstream news condition would be polarized just a bit relative to the control. And finally, I was looking at how partisanship will predict attitudes and predicted that they will do so more strongly for like-minded news. So partisanship will predict your attitude most strongly on the Keystone Pipeline when you're watching like-minded news, less so for a combination, and less so still for mainstream news. So here's what we find. First, this is the results for the mainstream clip. So we asked people after they watched the clip to simply tell us what was in the clip. Some interesting things here. First, there seem to be some discrepancies, so not everyone saw the same things in the clip, which is interesting. However, the discrepancies are not based on partisanship. So you see both Democrats and Republicans agree on the facts of the clip. So within the clip, it did say that the Keystone Pipeline would create more jobs. It hinted that it wouldn't affect crude oil demand, so I think this is why you see not 100% of people responding that this was contained within the clip. You see around 30% of people saying that the Keystone Pipeline would produce more pollution because of the type of crude oil that would be shipped through the pipeline. And then finally, you see both Democrats and Republicans agreeing after watching NBC News that the pipeline would have little environmental impact. Okay, so they agree here. But what did coverage look like when they watched the same report, but what did coverage look like and what did people come away with when they watched it on partisan news outlets? And here's where huge differences appear. So first, Democrats didn't see within their clip that it would create any jobs. Republicans saw a little bit. You see Democrats saying more so that it won't affect crude oil demand and Republicans a bit less so. But the final two bars, the two sets of bars, are where you see the tremendous differences. So for Democrats who watched MSNBC, they came away thinking this pipeline is containing the sort of oil that's going to increase pollution and it's terrible news for the environment. Fox News, Republicans watching Fox News came away with the entirely opposite impression of what was happening on the basis of this report, that in fact, the pipeline would have little environmental impact. So I think this is the first issue with partisan news media and how it creates polarization. It was the same report. It was coverage from each of the networks on the identical information, but people came away from those reports with totally different impressions of the facts of the report. So that's step one. Next is looking at media trust. How does media trust vary depending on whether you're looking at partisan media or mainstream news media? And this is one of the few moments where I think there's maybe a little bit of good news in my presentation. And that is when people watch like-minded media first, they rated about a 2.5. When they watched like-minded media second, so they watched mainstream media first, like-minded media second, they in fact trust like-minded media a little bit less. So this is good news. Same with mainstream media in the good news direction. When they watch mainstream news media first, they rate it also close to a 2.5. When they watch it second, so they watched like-minded first, mainstream second, they actually trust mainstream media a little bit more. So I think there's some sort of an anchoring effect that takes place where people say, okay, it was like-minded news, now mainstream looks a little bit better. I watched mainstream news, now I like-minded a little bit better. So I think people at least somewhat recognize some of the biases when they're seeing these two juxtaposed, one right after the other. Okay. Next, we asked people, do you think the pipeline would or would not pose a significant risk to the environment? In the control condition, Democrats and Republicans are different by about 20 percentage points. In the mainstream news condition, again, about 20 percentage points difference. As soon as any like-minded media is injected into the experimental stimuli, whether it came first, whether it came second, or whether it was a standalone, we start to see huge differences appear between Democrats and Republicans in terms of their impressions of whether the pipeline would or would not pose a significant risk to the environment. And this is despite the fact that in the mainstream news clip, they all agreed that the mainstream news clip said it would not, in fact, have an effect. So the difference is amplified for like-minded news to the highest degree, and very similar mainstream like-minded as well. So there's a huge difference in terms of whether people watching like-minded news between Democrats and Republicans in their beliefs about whether the pipeline would pose a significant risk to the environment. Similarly, when we asked people whether or not the pipeline would or would not create a significant number of jobs, in the control and mainstream conditions, you actually don't really get a significant difference between Democrats and Republicans. They actually can agree on whether or not the pipeline would create a significant number of jobs. Again, as soon as we insert any like-minded media, then we start to see differences emerge between Democrats and Republicans. So here you get Republicans significantly more likely than Democrats to say that the Keystone Pipeline will create a significant number of jobs. And I just want to point out again that in both this slide and the previous slide, the interesting component is any moment of like-minded news is what increases this difference between Democrats and Republicans. And mainstream news added to the mix doesn't seem to solve that to any significant degree. Next, I did an analysis of looking at how strongly partisanship predicts people's support for the Keystone Pipeline. The black line here is the control condition. So in the control condition, partisanship a little bit predicts support for the Keystone Pipeline, but it's not really a huge effect. Then you see the red line here is the mainstream news condition, and you see a little bit more partisanship emerging. It's not significantly different from the control, but even mainstream news, this kind of echoes a little bit what Kevin was suggesting, even mainstream news maybe has some power to polarize. And then you look at the like-minded condition, and this one really polarizes people. When people are watching like-minded news, they snap into their partisan positions in terms of their support for the Keystone Pipeline. The real question, though, is what happens when you have those middle two conditions? Can mainstream news, whether before or after like-minded news, moderate this? And they do to a degree, but it's not significant. Neither is significantly different from the like-minded condition. So I can't draw any conclusions here other than it doesn't seem like, to a significant degree, mainstream news, in fact, depresses any of the effects of like-minded news. So I'm not too optimistic to people who tell me, oh, we should just encourage partisan news folks to watch mainstream news. They'll take that information and depolarize a bit. I don't have any evidence supporting that claim for this case study. So conclusions. First, mainstream and partisan clips present different facts. They are presenting totally different facts. The same report was covered in tremendously different ways, and then people interpreted those quite differently, and viewers recognized those differences. Assessments of media credibility vary depending on order, and the way in which they varied, at least in this case study analysis, I think should give us a little bit of optimism. At least they're recognizing that there are differences in meaningful ways between mainstream news coverage and what a partisan news source might do. Finally, or almost finally, near finally, mainstream media doesn't affect partisan gaps in beliefs, but as soon as there's any hint of like-minded media, even when it's paired with mainstream media, you see these polarizing effects in terms of people's beliefs about the Keystone Pipeline. And finally, the effect of partisanship on attitudes varies by condition, such that, again, any dose of like-minded media snaps people into their partisan places more rapidly than any mainstream news condition. So again, this is just a case study, but I think this is really emblematic of how partisan media can have a polarizing effect overall. Thank you.